"Hey Craig, could you come take a look at these tracks? I'm not sure what they are." I silently groaned. Had you told me a year ago I'd be the research coordinator of the most comprehensive ecological survey of the North Pole since the discovery of the Northwest Passage, I'd have been ecstatic. When I accepted the position, the prospect of tracking and tagging polar bears in their natural environment was tantalizing. It was the first and only postdoc I'd been accepted for, and I could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel for my 10-year post-secondary education. It was the final step in becoming employable. Unfortunately, my actual day-to-day was less Arctic Steve Irwin and more undergraduate babysitter. The project had insisted on exclusively hiring student researchers because their wages were subsidized by the government. While this strategy reduced overhead costs, these well-meaning students often had little to no research experience and couldn't tell an Arctic fox from a sea lion. "Sure thing, Jasmine. I'll be right over," I said. As I slowly trudged through the snow, I again counted the number of days until this disappointment of a postdoc would conclude. "Sorry for bothering you again. I swear this one isn't a boot print," Jasmine quickly added. As I approached, I felt a pang of guilt as I remembered she was just doing her best, and I was being unjustly impatient. "Let's see what we have," I said in a strained voice, similar to what a dad settling into a chair at the end of a long day would make. As I kneeled down to examine the tracks, I was immediately intrigued. "It's definitely hooved. Not unusual, since the North American mountain goat." Jasmine cut me off. "Orinos americanus?" she asked. "Well done," I said, equally impressed at her growing knowledge and annoyed at having been interrupted. "And yeah, they're common up here. Looks like a pretty big one too." I squinted at the tracks, wondering if I'd ever seen a goat that big. "Craig, I don't mean to sound like a know-it-all, because I know you're much more experienced than I am, but wouldn't the mountain goats mostly stick to the mountains?" Jasmine asked in that careful way one does when they suspect they're missing an obvious detail. Surprised at my lack of situational awareness, I looked around the vast plains we were investigating. The nearest mountain was the North Pole Peak, and even that was over 50 kilometers away. It would be extremely unusual for a mountain goat to venture down here, since there is neither the food nor the security from predators that a goat would seek out. My goat explanation was admittedly weak. "That's a good point. However, it's the only hooved creature that would make sense. There haven't been bison or horses here for hundreds of years, and if you go back any further, you're already talking Pliocene. But you're absolutely correct that they shouldn't be out this far." At the end of my sentence, I stood up to look around. The snow-covered landscape was desolate of life at first glance, but I knew it was teeming with opportunistic hunters who used the landscape's plethora of hiding spots to their advantage. Being in the open as we were was actually safer, since anything that could hurt you would be visible. Since it was snowing, tracks would rapidly be covered up. That the hoof prints we examined appeared as large and deep as they did meant that the animal had been here recently, and we never saw it. Checking my watch, I decided it was late enough. Darkness falls rapidly at this longitude, and we had to make up some ground back to camp. "Good catch, Jasmine. Take some photos of the tracks, and let's head out," I decided. When Jasmine finished up, we walked back towards camp. We noticed the hoof prints actually led in a similar direction to camp, and followed them since it was the same path. Anyway, goats generally didn't attack humans unless provoked, but that fact didn't help the hair standing up on the back of my neck. At one point, the tracks forked right while the path to camp led left. "Jasmine, you fork left. It's another 100 meters to camp. I'm going to see where these tracks go," I said, knowing she'd protest. "I'll come with you. I'm curious too," she said excitedly. "No," I replied a little too quickly, feeling guilty for excluding her. "You need to start uploading the data. It'll take you at least an hour, and there's already work to do when we get there." She nodded solemnly and left towards camp. What I didn't tell her was that the too large to be a goat tracks were now specked with drops of blood. I felt my own blood leave my face as I marched down the hill alongside the tracks, motivated equally by the responsibility I bore for the well-being of my students and the excitement for my craft that I hadn't felt since my first day. I couldn't resist the prospect of seeing something genuinely interesting. I walked another 50 meters and considered turning back when I heard a low moan in the trees to my left. "Hello," I shouted. "Do you need help?" "Oh," was the reply. It sounded like an older man with a deep baritone voice. I wasn't sure if it was in response to me. "I'm so sorry, my friend," he said, ominously. Against all of my instincts, I approached knowing that no other help would come this man's way. The trees opened up into a grove. The moon shone through the trees like a spotlight, illuminating what I quickly identified as a macabre scene. Bewilderingly, a red sleigh lay topside, ornate with jeweled mosaics and artistic depictions of snow, wind, and ice. The ropes were limply attached to brown lumps recognizable as deer only by virtue of their antlers. The sickening smell of fresh blood filled my nostrils as I noticed these poor animals had been gruesomely disemboweled, their intestines contrasting with the once pristine white snow. A couple of them appeared just barely alive, slowly and helplessly writhing in pain. A bearded man clad in red lay next to one of the deer, holding its head and caressing it. The animal had a large red bump where its nose should have been, but it didn't resemble a wound. Behind the man was a trail of blood grimly representing the distance he'd crawled towards the animal. "Hey," I shouted, "I'll call help. Stay right where you." I was cut off by the sound of an enormous branch cracking. The bearded man looked at me with frenzied panic in his eyes and shifted his gaze to the breaking tree branch as it happened. As I glanced in turn, what I saw subverted hundreds of years' worth of Arctic megafauna research, but aligned perfectly with the preceding eons of mythology and folklore. The beast was impossibly large. Its torso alone was like a bison standing on its hind legs which, inexplicably, were curved backwards and hooved like only a goat's legs could be, or so I thought. Its gorilla-like arms were donned in fur black as coal and were as thick as the tree trunks which surrounded us. Rather than having a gorilla's fist, the nightmarish creature boasted black claws that would be the subject of envy among butchers. This unnatural hodgepodge of predators' features was topped by a pumpkin-sized head that could not be the product of natural selection or any other earthly process. It had horns like curled mammoth's tusks, each thick enough to rival an African elephant. Its black, beady, lifeless eyes were paradoxically paired with the most maniacal smile I had ever seen. The face itself was strewn with tattered remnants of rotting flesh, its exposed ivory skull reflecting the moonlight like it was a forest-dwelling grim reaper. Its teeth were longer and unnervingly thinner than should have been possible, like a series of lengthwise razor blades standing on end. Its chest was darker in the center than the perimeter. I originally thought this was a pattern in its fur, but I felt my stomach turn as I realized the sinister entity was soaked in a bib of blood. I could only watch as the helpless St. Nicholas made frantic and futile attempts to crawl further into the woods. With unnatural speed, the underworld horror descended from the tree and closed ground on the once jolly Father Christmas. Squatted over top of the prone man, the malevolent being sunk its claws into Claus' arms, not to kill, but to maim. Pinning him with one arm, it reached its claws into the whimpering man's back and slowly raked its nails like a cruel, old-fashioned teacher would drag their nails on a chalkboard. Similarly to the noise that would produce, Claus let out a shriek of pain and fear unparalleled to anything I'd ever witnessed. The slow torture continued for much longer than any benevolent god would have allowed. I watched in silent, abject horror as the cruel display unfolded, unable to move my legs. The cruel being flipped Claus, who now lay lifeless on his back. It began feasting on him like it had preyed on the man for eons. I felt my heart stop as it locked eyes with me without ceasing its feeding. My peripheral vision waned and eventually faded to black as I felt the vague sensation of falling limply onto my side. I woke up in camp. Apparently my team found me in the grove, laying unconscious. I told my story, which was met with sympathetic disbelief. Despite my insistence, the sleigh, deer, man, and creature were never found. The only remnant signs of carnage were the blood, felled trees, and tracks, for which I never heard a satisfactory explanation. I was unharmed with the exception of a single scar on my back, etched with unmistakable precision, resembling the letter K.